Good evening, and welcome to the 2015 Darwin College Lectures on the theme of development. I'd like to welcome everyone here in the Lady Mitchell Hall and in the overflow halls. This is the 30th year of the Darwin College Lectures, and we're delighted that by watching online, thousands of people can join our Friday evenings here in Cambridge. 30 years is a long time. The college has doubled in size through those decades, and now we have some 700 graduate students from about 75 countries around the world. Tonight's lecturer is the architect, Michael Pawlyn. An architect is an archi, chief, tekton, carpenter, in Greek, an influential profession through the ages. I am a plate tectonician, a geophysicist. We deal with earthquakes and volcanoes, forces that construct the earth but tend to ruin human settlements. Among the general clan of tectons, the impact of architectons is perhaps greatest. Architects shape our lives. We move where they want us to move, eat where they place us, sleep where they give us rest. Perhaps the best architects are actually in nature. And as usual, Darwinian evolution has found smart solutions long before humans. Go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways, says the Bible. Though Leonardo da Vinci was skeptical regarding bees as more holistic architects. The men of experiment are like the ants, they only collect and use. But the bee gathers its materials from the flowers of the garden and of the field, transforms and digests it by a power of its own. Perhaps, though, he didn't know about termites. Now, this week, we hear that spider silk has been usurped from its place as the strongest natural material, usurped by limpet teeth. The strength of limpet teeth approaches that of the strongest man-made material, carbon fibers. The researchers suggest that these high-strength composite teeth highlight a design strategy for new, strong, engineered composites. Now, Michael Pawlyn is a pioneer in biomimicry. He uses biological adaptations as a source of inspiration. He's had a very distinguished career, even being chosen by Google to speak on the zeitgeist of our age. His book, Biomimicry in Architecture, is proving very influential, and one of his talks has had 1 million online viewings. So Michael, as one of the leading archi-carpenters of our time, we look forward to your thoughts.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me. It's a great honor to be here. So I'm going to be talking about biomimicry, which is my favorite subject, and it's also the subject which I think is going to be one of the most important sources of new solutions in the decades ahead. Possibly the most difficult decades that humanity will have faced. But what I'm going to try and argue is that actually biomimicry is going to be one of the best sources of solutions for the kind of challenges we're going to have to face. Now, one of my favorite quotations is from the musician John Cage, who said, "Some people are scared of new ideas. I'm scared of old ones." And I'm going to talk about the scary old ideas as little as necessary, barely at all, in fact, and the new ideas as much as possible. And that's because I want to focus on solutions. And I'll explain in a few minutes what I mean by biomimicry, and I'll give a few examples of that. But first of all, I just want to say a few words about the context and what sort of drives me to really pursue this as a fairly new direction in architecture. I think it's a very difficult time for those who are committed to the environment. Many of the world's governments are unfortunately asleep at the wheel. And there's also, I think, a very unhelpful chasm between conventional economists and between environmentalists. So with many conventional economists, they argue that there isn't a strong enough case for action, But on the other hand, there are environmentalists who often use such gloomy language that it's really off-putting. And we're increasingly accustomed to seeing graphs like this, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, so I'm really not going to say much about that at all. And it's really quite surprising that conventional economists don't really get this, and I'm sure you've all come across this one before. And many of the trends that we are seeing in the environment are exponential, and yet still the economists don't quite get it. And there's a very nice little anecdote about when Satish Kumar went to visit the head of the London School of Economics. And his opening gambit was, do you have a Department of Ecology? And the chap looked a bit bemused and said, no. And Satish then said, well, do you know the derivation of the word economy? Not sure. Well, it comes from the Greek word ekos, meaning home, and nomos, meaning management. It's very similar to ecology, which comes from ekos, meaning home, and logos, meaning knowledge. So how can you manage your home without knowledge of it? You're producing students who are only half educated. I don't think Satish was invited back after that. But anyway, I think it is an important point. And there are still some skeptics who claim that we really don't have a problem, while at the same time there are increasingly alarming analyses coming from scientists predicting that we could face a perfect storm of resource shortages, climate chaos, and overpopulation. I think we urgently do need a more sophisticated approach to economics. And when looked at from an ecological perspective, conventional economics is woefully inadequate. We need approaches that accommodate complexity. And I'm going to be saying a little bit about that in the course of my talk. So now let me explain a little bit more about what I mean by biomimicry. I'll give a couple of examples. This is a beetle. It's called the bark beetle, and it can detect a forest fire at somewhere between 10 and 80 kilometers, depending on which scientist you believe. Now, if you compare that with conventional man-made fire detectors, human-made fire detectors, you might be able to see one or two on the ceiling, they have a range of about 8 meters. So this is about 10,000 times as sensitive. What's more, it doesn't need a continuous connection back to a power station burning fossil fuels. You might wonder, why the hell would a beetle fly towards a fire? It actually flies to where the fire has just passed through, and it lays its eggs in freshly burnt wood. And there's a kind of popular science explanation for why it does this, which goes roughly like this. When it gets to where the fire has just passed through, all its mates are there, it can have unlimited sex with no predators around, and you don't get much better than that in the beetle world. But the important point is that it's an amazing adaptation to a very specific niche. Who would have thought such sensitive fire detectors would exist in biology? And if we could learn how it does that, then we could start developing much more effective, much more energy efficient fire detectors ourselves. Here's another good beetle. It does seem as though the beetles have some of the best tricks. This is the bombardier beetle, which defends itself against predators by firing a high temperature explosion out of its abdomen. It has a combustion chamber in which it mixes two highly unstable chemicals, hydroquinone and hydrogen peroxide. And to stop the combustion migrating back to the fuel tanks, there are inlet valves that open and close 200 times a second. So engineers have been studying this beetle in order to develop more efficient fuel injection systems, needle-free medical injections, and even a new form of fire extinguisher. Now, the closest that humans have come to this, and I hope I won't offend any German people in the audience with this example, this was the closest that I'm aware humans have come. This is the Messerschmitt 163, which mixed together exactly the same compounds, hydroquinone and hydrogen peroxide. They didn't have quite the same fuel mixing technology, so a lot of these burst into fireballs on the ground. They weren't very popular with the pilots. But they were definitely aware of the beetle, because they had this sticker on the side of the plane which said, "Wie ein Floh, aber oho," which in my bad German translates roughly as "like a beetle, but whoa." So here's my favorite example of biomimicry, and this is the dog vomit slime mold. And we need more of this, and I'll explain why. Particularly in cities, we need more dog vomit slime mold. Slime molds are single-celled organisms which form minimum distance networks between sources of food. And in 2009, scientists at Hokkaido University carried out an experiment in which they took a map of the Tokyo region and they put a little source of food on each of the cities surrounding Tokyo, and then they put a slime mold on Tokyo itself. So the slime mold spread out quite quickly, it located all those sources of food, and then it started optimizing the connections between those. And when that slime mold had finished its little exercise, the layout exactly matched the railway layout, the railway network layout in that part of Japan. So it had taken the engineers thousands of hours to arrive at that optimization. The slime mold did it in 26 hours, which suggests that we do still have a bit to learn. But the key point is that if we could learn from biological organisms to develop biologically based algorithms, then we could start to create much more efficient networks, much more efficient building design, use less resources, and so on. And overall, I think you could look at the living natural world as being like a design sourcebook in which all the products have benefited from a 3.8 billion year research and development period, and to make things even better, all the faulty products have been withdrawn from the marketplace. So given that level of investment, it kind of makes sense to make use of that. And slightly less frivolously, of course, I'm talking about the long and ruthless process of evolution, which has left us with some amazing success stories that we can learn from. And I think there are three really big challenges that we need to address over the next few decades. The first is achieving radical increases in resource efficiency, so doing more with far less. The second is shifting from linear, wasteful, and polluting ways of using resources to closed-loop models, in which all the resources are stewarded within closed loops and no waste is lost and no pollution is emitted. And the third one is the shift from the fossil fuel economy to a solar economy. And if we choose to embark on these three interlinked journeys, then, in my opinion, there is no better source of ideas than biomimicry, because all the examples that you'll be learning from are biological organisms that have already adapted to these very constraints. So what I'll do now is I'll just describe some projects that we've worked on that have used these ideas that will perhaps convey a bit more clearly what biomimicry is and how it can be used. So this project was our opportunity to use biomimicry to rethink office design and to use it in a way that was perhaps more comprehensive than it had been used hitherto. Biomimicry has been used quite a bit for individual products. Velcro is an old example. But here we were trying to apply it in a really comprehensive way to create a complete environment for people to work in. And we persuaded the client to allow us to do a concept study first with a minimum of constraints, so no particular site, a very loose brief, and we said we had to have a really excellent team which must include a biologist. Now, architects sometimes, perhaps I'm being a bit rude about my profession here, but architects towards the sort of iconic end of the spectrum, the way they work with their consultants is that sometimes they will just do the sort of sexy sketch and then they will expect the rest of the team to just make it happen. And I think if you've gone to the trouble of appointing a really excellent team, that approach is verging on insulting. I think you need a much more collaborative approach to draw the best ideas out of the team. And for me, the model is really a sort of conductor. So a conductor doesn't necessarily make any sound at all, but relies for his or her power on making other people powerful and drawing that together in a unified vision. So that's the kind of thing that inspires us. And this was a wonderfully enjoyable exercise, working with a fantastic team, including a biologist. And in the first workshop, we concluded that one of the most powerful drivers of the building form was likely to be daylight. So we looked at how daylight was, just before I come on to that, these were the things we aimed for. We wanted to achieve a minimum 10% increase in productivity, for the building as far as possible to be passively self-heating and cooling, to be entirely lit with daylight, and for it to be a net producer of energy, and for the air coming out to be cleaner than the air going in. And the last three there, I would argue, are going beyond sustainable design to achieve restorative or net positive results. I do think it is time we move beyond the sustainability paradigm, which all too often was about mitigating negatives. It was about trying to make things slightly less bad. We need to move to a much more positive mindset, which is about optimizing positives and achieving a restorative or regenerative result. So with the daylight, we looked at biological organisms such as, in this case, the spookfish. And spookfish, these are fish that have amazing mirror-shaped eyes. And these mirror structures are able to focus low-level bioluminescence coming up from the deep ocean onto the fish's retina. Another one we looked at is the stone plant. These are plants that live in deserts, and for reasons of thermal stabilization, most of the plant is below the ground. And that's so that the chemical reactions can take place at a fairly steady temperature, so all the chlorophyll is down in what you could call the basement, and then it has a kind of roof light in the top that allows the light down into to where the chlorophyll is. Another one we looked at is the brittle star. Now this is a starfish that lives as much as 500 meters below the ocean surface. And it's evolved a covering of near optically perfect lenses over its skin. And those are able to detect very small amounts of light and movement and focus them onto receptors so that it can see predators long before they see it. And all of these, and many others that we studied in addition to this, encouraged us to think much more creatively and deliberately about how we would bring light into this building. A fairly conventional way of designing for daylight in offices is to just think about the right distance between the windows. And in London, you can often find really deep offices that are 25, even 30, 40 meters deep. And you know that those kind of buildings are just going to be very energy intensive because they're dependent on artificial lighting and air conditioning. We concluded that the right dimension was about 12 meters. So no one is further than 6 meters from the nearest window. And then thinking about what kind of building form that suggested, well, one approach would be to just take these narrow floor plates and stack them up into a tall tower, which is fine if you're working in a dense urban location with high land values. We wanted to create something a bit more universal than that as a concept, so we looked at two other building forms. One was like a ring, a squarish ring of offices around a central atrium, and then the third one was a more linear approach, where you have two linear blocks and an atrium down the middle. And it was the third one that seemed to work best when we analyzed the light levels. Looking at light levels in plan, what we found is that we got this kind of curved pattern of shading towards the middle of each block because of the shading effect of the opposite block. So the next move was to simply bend those floor plates to create these curved blocks so we get a very even quality of light all the way along. And this produced two further challenges. The first is that narrow floor plates aren't particularly good for creative clusters of people. You need some parts of the floors that are wider. And also, this wasn't making very efficient use of a rectangular site. We were probably going to end up with a rectangular site. So then, learning further ideas from biology of surface area to volume optimization and so on, we elaborated the plan form into this undulating form. So now we have much better facilities for creative clusters of people, and still no one is further than about 6 meters from the nearest window. And still looking at daylight and looking at the building now in section, what we found is that we could fairly easily get enough light in the upper parts of the building. The struggle was how we would get light in further down. So we looked at the possibility of harvesting light near the top and focusing it into fiber optic tubes and channeling it around the building. And for this, we looked at a rainforest plant called Anthurium warraquinum, which again lives in very low light conditions, and it has lenses all over its leaves. So this proved to be pretty complicated, so that's become a research project which we've parked. There wasn't really the time to do that within the constraints of this study, so we'll come back to that. But what we did conclude is that it was worth shaping the building and incorporating this large-scale light reflector like the spookfish eye that would bounce light deeper into the lower parts of the building. And then thinking about what we would do underneath that large-scale light reflector, we thought this was a great opportunity to create a really dramatic meeting space that would add value to the building and would have some of the qualities of the sort of film sets that Ken Adam designed for Stanley Kubrick and so on. Now, what we saw there was that it was the daylight that was really the primary driver of the architectural form, rather than structure or ventilation and so on. So now looking at the structure, the way we use biomimicry, was to try to reduce the amount of resources as much as possible. And we wanted to use material much more efficiently. And so we started looking at biological structures like bird skulls. That's what I'm drawing here. And what we found is that you often get very complex structures that achieve their efficiency of resources by putting the material exactly where it needs to be. So in the case of bird skulls, you have these very, very thin layers of bone connected together with struts and ties. So it's like a combination of dome technology and space frame technology. And we also looked at cuttlebone, which is quite similar. Again, you have very thin layers of bone with these undulating walls. So creating a very stiff structure, quite a complex structure, but using an absolute minimum of resources. And we analyzed a fairly generic floor, slab, and column arrangement. And we looked at it in terms of which parts were working hard structurally and which bits were rather redundant. And what we found is that all these bits that I'm shading in dark here, these are the bits that are not doing anything structurally. So the center of the columns, the middle of the floors, and so on. And if we were to shape the structure so that it followed the shape that it wants to be, it would probably end up looking something like this. So we would have hollow columns because the center is not doing anything. We'd have slightly deeper floors where the bending moments were highest. And then we would take out some of that mass with void formers. And these are technologies that already exist, so we're just pushing them a little bit further. The top one is fabric formwork, and the bottom one is bubble deck. And so this was actually getting reasonably close to the examples that we started with. And I think this demonstrates why biomimicry can be a very powerful tool for designers and engineers and so on, because it allows the conversation to wander off in pursuit of the most ideal solutions. And once you've established that, then you can come back to something that is achievable within the constraints that you're working with. I take the view that you should never start with reality. You should always start by identifying the ideal and compromising as little as necessary. And if I had more time, I'd love to tell you how we learned from termites to design a passive heating and cooling system, how we learned from plants like Mimosa pudica, the sensitive plant, and from folding beetle wings to design a solar shading system which lets in exactly the right amount of light and converts all surplus light into electricity, and how we learned from curved leaf shapes and shell forms to design a new glazing system that is based on very thin curved pieces of glass, which, subject to the research and development that we've got to do on it, should achieve a roughly 50% saving in glass on the building. And this is how the scheme looks now. So you can see many of the ideas that I talked about a few minutes ago, the strategic form driven by daylight, the Spookfish light reflector in the atrium there, and you might just be able to make out the curved glass units. So those are very thin pieces of glass that are put back to back like that. So then they're strong enough to span between the floors. And we're talking incredibly thin pieces of glass, 2 layers of 0.9 millimeters toughened glass. And here's another view of the building. And then this is what the atrium looks like. And that's the Spookfish light reflector meeting room in the middle there. So you can see that instead of creating gloomy, gas-guzzling buildings that are soul-sapping to the occupants, it's perfectly possible to create really uplifting, light-filled spaces that are inspiring for people to work in and regenerative to the human spirit. And this was only a few percent more expensive than a more conventional approach. And we did a back-of-the-envelope calculation for the client. This is likely to be built in Zurich. And we worked out that the building cost was about 90 million Swiss francs, and the people in that building, let's say there are roughly 3,000 people on a salary of 100,000 Swiss francs. So the annual salary bill is 300 million Swiss francs. If you can achieve a 10% increase in productivity, which is perfectly possible, there are peer-reviewed experiments that have shown a 20% increase in productivity is possible, a 10% increase in productivity is worth 30 million Swiss francs. Which means that the building would pay for itself completely in 3 years. Now, it's actually quite difficult to convince clients and certainly conventional economists of this approach, but I do think we've seen a shift in thinking. 10 years ago, all people seemed to talk about was the value of energy saved. And actually, that's not a big sum of money, particularly when you're talking about a commercial office building. I think now people are talking much more about the importance of looking after your staff, making sure they're happy and productive, and also attracting the right people. Companies like Google spend enormous amounts just to attract the right people. And they actually have an official policy in Google of, they call it raising the coolness factor of the company. And they will justify expenditure on things that sometimes have very long payback periods, but they do it because it raises the coolness factor of the company and they attract the right people and they see all sorts of benefits. And that's the kind of thing I mean when I'm talking about a more comprehensive view of economics. Office buildings have been improving, actually. Architects and engineers have been steadily designing more and more energy efficient offices, which is great. The one area that's been getting steadily worse, though, is data, IT. Energy consumption in IT has just been going steadily upwards. And that's partly because of the way we use servers and data centers. Often they're in buildings or in urban areas, and they need a huge amount of cooling. And it's the cooling which really increases the energy consumption. So what could biology possibly teach us about data centers? They don't exist in biology. And this is where it's important to remember that biomimicry and biomimetics is a functional discipline. So it's about identifying functions and seeing how those have been solved in biology. So if you see how animals keep themselves cool, it's normally pretty simple measures. You know, they don't have access to really intense forms of energy like fossil fuels, so they just do simple things, behavioral things like moving somewhere that is cooler, or evaporative cooling by panting or sweating. So the first move on this project was to relocate the server and to put it somewhere that is already extremely cold and rely on high-speed data transmission to get the data to the users. The very cold location here is a mountain in Norway that has already been carved out for marble mining. And there are about 90 linear kilometers of tunnels that are all at a temperature of about 5 degrees centigrade all year round. So then the challenge was, how do we draw that really cool air through the server, through the data center, in order to keep it cool? What's the most efficient way of drawing that air through? And this time we looked at a phenomenon in biology that's referred to as Murray's law. This is a mathematical constant or mathematical ratio that seems to be true of most branching systems in biology. There is a cubed ratio between the vessels in branching systems. So the cube of the diameter of the parent vessel is equal to the sum of the cube of the two daughter vessels. There also seems to be a very consistent angle, which seems to follow the principles of hydrodynamics and aerodynamics. So overall, this appears to be an evolved minimum energy solution. And I must admit, when we first presented this to the engineers that were on the project before us and had produced these very linear layouts of data blocks in long lines with long lines of ductwork and a lot of bends, they thought we were kind of borderline insane. But I'm pleased to say that we did persuade them of the benefits of this, because the first move was to arrange the data blocks, which are the individual components of the data center, into a circular cluster. And at a stroke, that reduced the length of ductwork enormously, and the number of bends. And then we used Murray's law to optimize that branching network. And although that might look perhaps a bit overindulgent, that is actually trying to be really rigorous about following this mathematical rule, Murray's law, in order to arrive at a theoretically perfectly efficient extract system. So this would draw the cool air through the data centers and keep them functioning using a minimum of energy. This is how the showpiece data center will look like at the center of the mountain. And this does have a bit of a James Bond feel about it, actually, this project. Because first of all, you have to come through a scanner, and you go down this long tunnel into the mountain, and then you get in a boat to cross this underground lake, and you end up at the cavern in the center where the showpiece server is, and then there's a shaft that'll take the exhaust air up to a disused quarry at the top where the client says he wants to do a mini Eden project, and I suspect he'll be waiting up there with his white cat saying, "Mr. Bond, I've been expecting you." So if you remember, I mentioned three big transformations: radical increases in resource efficiency, linear to closed loops, and a fossil fuel to a solar economy. So the two projects we've looked at so far, they were mainly about achieving radical increases in resource efficiency. So designing an office building that was far more energy efficient, and in the case of a data center, producing a data center that used radically less energy. So what I'm going to talk about now is a project that explores ideas of closed-loop design. And conventionally, humans have tended to use resources in a rather linear way. We dig things out of the ground, we use them and dispose of them. Sometimes, I read a statistic from RAP that roughly 70% of what we take out of the ground is back in the ground within a year, which is phenomenally wasteful. Mature ecosystems are completely different. All the resources are stewarded within closed-loop cycles, the nitrogen, the carbon, the water, and so on. And there have been quite a few industrial projects that have attempted to mimic this idea, modeling themselves on ecosystems. There's one in Denmark called Kalundborg, in which a number of industries were co-located, so they could all benefit from each other's waste streams. And the waste from one becomes the input for something else in that system. The individual components of that one, Kalundborg, weren't particularly benign. They were a fossil fuel power station, a chemical works, and so on. So I'm keener on a project that's called the Cardboard to Caviar project. And I've got a little sketch that explains how this works. It was set up by a guy called Graham Wiles in Kirklees and Calderdale. And what they did is that they collected cardboard from shops and restaurants, and then they shredded it, and they sold it to equestrian centres as horse bedding. When that was soiled, they were paid to collect the manure and the cardboard. They put it into wormery composting systems, which produced worms, which they fed to Siberian sturgeon, which produced caviar, which they sold back to the restaurant. Which is quite nice, because it's turned this linear system into a closed-loop system, and they've actually earned money along the way. They were paid for the bedding, they were paid to take away the soil bedding, they were paid for the fish, they were paid for the caviar. And I'd been using this example shamelessly in talks for about 3 years probably, and then I was asked to come and teach on an intensive design course at Shoemaker College, and I thought it was about time I found out a bit more about this. And I invited myself up there, and Graham Wiles showed me round. He was an extremely generous chap with his knowledge, and it turned out that the fuller picture was much more interesting than that summary. So when he started, it was really just this first part of the diagram here. He was involving people with disabilities in a recycling initiative, shredding cardboard and selling it to the equestrian centres. And that was as far as it went. And then the horsey folks said, okay, well, what do we do with all this cardboard and manure? And Graham said, leave it with me, I'll have a think about it. And his first idea was to set up a wormery and to sell the worms to a fishing bait supplier. So he did that, and then at the 11th hour, the fishing bait supplier backed out of the deal. I don't know what happened, the global worm market had collapsed or something. So Graham thought, okay, well, I'm going to cut out the middleman, I'm going to set up my own fish farm. And this time he started working with reforming heroin addicts, who were quite a difficult bunch of teenage kids on the whole, and they were costing the local authority as much as £100,000 per addict per year on rehab schemes with a 95% failure rate. Graham has achieved a 65% success rate at getting the kids off drugs and back into something more productive with a fraction of the amount of money. What they found was that the fish weren't putting on enough weight in winter because the water was too cold. And by this stage, they'd been given quite a big area of brownfield, formerly industrial land, that was next to a Yorkshire water treatment facility. So they used some of the treated fertilizer sludge from the sewage works to restore this land, and they planted willow biomass, which would run a biomass boiler that would keep the fish happy in winter. Then they found that they were having to spend a certain amount of money on fish food to supplement the worms. And Graham didn't like anything leaking out of the system. So he thought about what he could do, and he got the kids growing vegetables so they could make their own fish food. As it turned out, the kids ate all the vegetables, but in many ways that was a good thing, because prior to that they were coming to the site every day with a can of Coke and a Mars bar for their lunch. Little wonder that they have certain behavioral challenges. So now they were learning about growing and eating healthier food. Then they restored more industrial land. They planted orchards, so that would be another product that could be sold back to the shops and restaurants. They redesigned the water treatment from the fish tanks, and they created these long planting beds for watercress that would take out all the excess nutrients and produce another product for the shops and restaurants. Then Graham heard that there was a bakery nearby that was throwing away tons of moldy bread every week. And he found out that you can raise maggots on moldy bread with none of the smells of meat-based production. So that was another input to the system, transforming waste into a resource. And a further one that's not on here is that he built a smokehouse to add value to the fish. And this time, he worked with people returning from conflict zones who often come back with post-traumatic stress disorder, sometimes disabilities, and a shocking number of them actually end up in prison. And whatever we might think about the rights and wrongs of the Iraq War, these are people that have made a really big sacrifice and arguably deserve much better treatment. So he was involving them in this system which was restorative and rehabilitative. And what I think is wonderful about this is that he didn't plan it all at the beginning. He let it evolve over time, and he used ingenuity. Every time he saw something leaking out of the system or there was something that he needed to buy in, he would think about what he could add to that system to create more value, transforming waste into resource. And just as real biological ecosystems increase in diversity and resilience over time, there's a real sense in which the more this grows, the more the number of possibilities increase. And he's been resourceful with the idea of waste in every sense, including what is arguably the most deplorable form of waste, and that is underutilized human resources. He's managed to reintegrate 3 marginalized groups, people with disabilities, reforming heroin addicts, and people from conflict zones, in a scheme that is really regenerative. And they've boosted the biodiversity on this site, they've provided employment, and so on. And he actually had a meeting with his local MP and showed him around the site, and asked if he could have a bit of money to expand the facility. And the MP, I think, was a conventional economist, because he said, well, there's an industrial fish farm down the road and they produce fish much more cheaply than you, so no. Now, I wasn't there, but if I had been, I'd have been tempted to use a line I once heard in a comedy club, which was, if only life were as simple as you are, mate. So, I just want to compare some of the characteristics of conventional human-made systems with biological systems, because I think the Cardboard to Caviar project demonstrates the key characteristics of biological systems. So ours tend to be simple and disconnected, whereas biological systems are complex and interconnected. Ours tend to be linear and wasteful. Biology is closed loop and zero waste. Ours tend to be resistant to change. Biology is adapted to constant change. Biology doesn't use long-term toxins, it runs on current solar income, it's optimized as a whole system, and really importantly, it is regenerative rather than extractive. And I think that right-hand list is a very good summary of the key transformations that we need to bring about if we're to shift from the industrial age of humankind to what I would call the ecological age of humankind. So we've been playing with these ideas, and we wanted to develop a scheme for an inner city area. And the idea was that we would create a productive greenhouse with a restaurant inside. There's a very successful example in the Netherlands. It's called De Cas, where they've already done that. So you eat in amongst the plants, and it may be as little as a few hours between the crops being on the plants to being on your plate. Incredibly fresh. We thought it would be great if we could have an anaerobic digester in this building. So we would collect biological waste from the local urban area and compost it to produce methane, to produce energy and fertilizer from the sludge. We wanted to also treat wastewater, and this is a technology called living machines, which uses microorganisms and plants to treat wastewater. And after the fantastic Cardboard to Caviar project, we thought it'd be great to have a fish farm that would be fed with vegetable waste from the restaurant kitchen and would in turn supply fish to the restaurant. We also heard that spent coffee grains are actually an ideal substrate for growing mushrooms. There's still a huge amount of value in spent coffee grains, so we thought this was another addition. And just for fun, we chose a really challenging site. This is Old Street Roundabout. It's a complete eyesore. And it's surrounded by about 4 lanes of traffic, so no one can get to that at the moment. And with just a fairly small amount of changing to the traffic, we could transform that. Since the congestion charge, nearly all the traffic comes from over here and ends up going that way. So we proposed that we would build this productive restaurant greenhouse on a sort of peninsula that would reclaim that as public space, and then all the traffic, most of the traffic would just go around that side. So the idea here is to bring together cycles of food, energy, water, and waste in a way that allows the output from one to become the input for something else in that system. So it's moving towards being a zero-waste, highly productive system that also creates a fantastic amenity. And if we think of cities as having a metabolism, then this is a way to rethink the whole metabolism of cities and look at these vast linear flows of resources and waste and transform them from problems into massive solutions. The final project I'm going to talk about is called the Sahara Forest Project. And this is one that we've been working on for about 7 years now. And what we were trying to do here was to think about integrated solutions. I think there has been a tendency for designers and environmentalists sometimes to think about one problem at a time, whether that is desertification or climate change or water shortages. And we had a hunch that there would be a way of addressing multiple challenges simultaneously if we were to think in a really integrative way. And we were quite surprised to learn that a lot of the world's deserts were actually vegetated a fairly short time ago. So when Julius Caesar arrived in North Africa, what he found was this wooded landscape of cedar trees and cypress trees. And to give you some idea of the abundance that existed, Pliny wrote about the amazing abundance of animals and fruits in the forests, and recorded that for the opening party of the Colosseum in Rome, some 9,000 elephants, panthers, and bears were transported from North Africa to the Colosseum to fight Christians in gladiatorial combat. Say what you like about the Romans, but they knew how to throw a good party. And really what Julius Caesar started there was this very extractive model of land use. They cleared the forests to create an intensive farm, and for about 150 years it provided vast quantities of grain to the Roman Empire. But after that point, they found that they had substantially trashed that landscape. It had become salinized, it had lost most of its nutrients, which had just been effectively washed out into the ocean through the collective digestive system of the Roman Empire. And they'd even changed the rainfall patterns. Believe it or not, that used to be quite a plentiful rainfall regime. And by the time they'd finished, it was really a desert. And that process has continued up until the present day. We've tended to adopt a very extractive model of land use. The other remarkable thing about deserts is the amount of energy that falls on the world's deserts is phenomenal. If we could capture even a small amount of that, that would go a long way towards addressing our energy needs. And it's reasonably easy to work out the amount of energy we receive as a planet from the sun every year. And if you compare that with the amount of energy we use, we receive roughly 6,000 to 7,000 times as much energy as we use. So I'm not suggesting that this shift from the fossil fuel age to the solar age is going to be an easy one. It's not. It's going to be very challenging. But that statistic of 6,000 to 1 does at least suggest it is possible. It's a challenge to our ingenuity, but it is possible. This animation shows photosynthetic activity around the world over the course of a number of years. And what's interesting is that you can see that the boundaries of those deserts move back and forth over the course of each year. And that raised the question for us of whether we could intervene at some of those boundary conditions to halt or even reverse desertification. And one of the reasons I think this is very important is because most biologists agree that if you look at the evolution of life on planet Earth, it was really the colonization of the Earth by plants that helped create the benign climate we currently enjoy. And the converse is also true. The more plant matter we lose and the more we allow deserts to grow, the more that is likely to exacerbate climate change and lead to further desertification. And here's another fairly alarming study. This was carried out by the Complex Systems Institute in the US, looking at the link between the food price index and occurrences of civil unrest. And they mapped all the instances of significant civil unrest around the world over the course of about 10 years. And you can see that there are two main clusters there. And they then linked that with the food price index. And you can see that there's a very close link between spikes in the food price index and examples of civil unrest. People sometimes feel uncomfortable when you talk about examples of civil unrest or even violence and criminality, and you try and find the reasons that lie behind it. I think people feel uneasy that it's as if you're trying to excuse it. But I think there's a big difference between excusing civil unrest and refusing to accept the conditions that are likely to make it more likely to happen. And it's pretty clear from this that when the food price rises above a certain level, then civil unrest is almost automatically going to happen somewhere. And also, if we map onto this the oil price, you can see that the oil price tends to spike about 3 months before the food price. And that's because most of our food production is incredibly dependent on fossil fuels. And with the long-term trend of oil heading ever upwards, I think the current point is a bit of an anomaly, mainly because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the US and Saudi Arabia have engineered this in order to try and bankrupt Russia. But in the long term, it's very likely to be continuing to go on upwards. And the suggestion there is pretty alarming. It suggests that civil unrest is going to become more and more likely unless we do something about this. So there's an urgent need to break the link between fossil fuels and food production. And that's what we've been trying to do on this project. We're trying to find a way to produce agriculture at scale while revegetating areas of desert and just using solar energy. If you're interested in biomimicry and you're working in a desert location, then there's a lot that you can learn from the organisms that have already adapted to life there. And this is a fantastic example. This is called the Namibian fog-basking beetle. And it's evolved a way of harvesting its own fresh water in a desert. What it does is it comes out of its hiding place at night, it crawls to the top of a sand dune, and then because it's got a matte black shell, it's able to radiate heat out to the night sky and become slightly cooler than its surroundings. So when the moist breeze blows in off the sea, you get these droplets of water forming on the beetle's shell. Just before the sun comes up, tips its shell up, water runs down to its mouth, has a good drink, goes off and hides the rest of the day. Not a great quality of life, but it's a clever trick, and that's good enough for me. And the ingenuity, if you could call it that, goes even further. Because if you look at the beetle's shell, it's got a whole series of little bumps on its shell, and those are hydrophilic. They attract water. And between them, there's a waxy finish which repels water. The effect of this is that as the droplets form, they stay in these very tight spherical droplets, which means they're much more mobile than they would be if it was just a mist over the whole shell. So even when there's only a small amount of moisture in the air, it's still able to harvest that very efficiently and channel it down to its mouth. A great example of an adaptation to a very resource-constrained environment. And that's why I think biomimicry is such a powerful source of ideas, because more and more over the next few decades, we're going to be facing resource constraints. And it's reassuring to know that there'll be examples that we can look at in biology of organisms that have already adapted to those conditions. So our project involves 3 core technologies. One is a greenhouse that is cooled and humidified with seawater, inspired by the beetle. The second is forms of solar energy, and the third is desert revegetation techniques. So let me explain a bit more about how this works. So if we look at some comparative temperatures, let's say the temperature of the desert at night is about 30 degrees C, which is quite cozy, really. The temperature of outer space is at minus 273 degrees C, which is a bit nippy. And you can get a matte black surface to radiate heat out to outer space on a clear night and lose heat. And this is how the ancient Persians made ice thousands of years ago. They would put down a bed of straw, they would put a shallow ceramic tray on that with a matte black glaze and a thin layer of water. And on a clear night, that radiation out to outer space was enough to form ice, and they would scoop it up before sunrise and use it to make drinks. So our greenhouse, the idea is that we have a double layer roof, and then during the day we bring seawater in and we evaporate it from evaporators to cool and humidify the growing environment. So that means there's a much better growing environment for crops in arid regions. They need less water and there's less thermal stress. Then at night, we drop the lower layer of the roof, and we still humidify that with seawater, but now we use a high emissivity surface, just like the Persian ice maker and the Beetle shell, and that means that a lot of that humidity condenses out as distilled water, and then it runs down and we can collect it and use it for irrigation during the day. When we think about biology, we often think about it as being all about competition. And certainly there is a lot of competition in ecosystems, but it's now thought to be slightly less significant than it once was. And if you look at mature ecosystems, you're really pretty likely to find examples of amazing symbiotic relationships in which organisms have hooked up for mutual benefits. So that's an important principle of biomimicry, looking for ways to bring technologies together in synergistic conditions. We looked around for technologies that would work well with the greenhouse, and the one we settled on was concentrated solar power. So this uses mirrors which track the sun, that focus the sun's heat to create electricity. And this and the greenhouse have some very interesting synergies. Firstly, they both work very well in hot, sunny deserts. Secondly, concentrated solar power, or CSP, that can be as much as 10% more productive if it has seawater cooling. And we can make use of most of that waste heat to evaporate more seawater and create more fresh water. And possibly the most interesting synergy is that the shade created by those mirrors makes it possible to grow a whole range of crops and plants that would not grow in direct sunlight in deserts because the energy is just way too intense. The idea with this project was to create a long hedge of greenhouses with concentrated solar power plants at intervals along the way, and this is how the scheme would look at big scale. So you can see the sea in the top right, the hedges of greenhouses with crops inside, the concentrated solar power at intervals along the way, and then on the left there, that was indicating the use of pioneer species trying to push back the boundaries of those deserts. It's a model for how we could create zero carbon food in some of the most water-stressed parts of the planet, while also producing abundant renewable energy and locking up carbon back in desert soils. That's where we were about 5.5 years ago, and we managed to get some very nice publicity for this. We got almost a whole page in The Guardian. It was picked up on lots of blogs and online magazines and so on. And we were hoping that we would get a phone call from a philanthropic tycoon saying, yep, I'll have one of those, please. But it didn't quite work out that way. So I started working through my address book, and I sent this to quite a few people, including a chap that I'd met at a conference before, a chap called Frederick Hauger of a Norwegian NGO called the Bologna Foundation. And, well, to cut a long story short, they became a partner in the project, and they brought with them amazing funding and political connections. And one of the first things we said to our Viking friends was, we're very pleased with the scheme, we're pretty confident about what it can do, but we don't feel as though we've got it in front of the right people yet. And a few months later, they heard that the King of Jordan was on a state visit to Norway, and they managed to get a meeting with him. They presented the project, and he had with him one of his ministers whose genuine job title was the Minister for Mega Projects, and he loved it as well. And we thought, yes, okay, now we're getting through to the right people. So this is my colleague meeting the King of Jordan. This led on to the funding of 3 feasibility studies in Jordan, and in a separate deal, feasibility studies in Qatar. And during these studies, we looked at all sorts of other technologies that could work well in our synergistic cluster, including algae for biofuels, halophytes, which are crops that can grow directly in seawater and produce food and fodder. We looked at evaporator hedges, which could take the brine from the greenhouse, evaporate it out towards saturation point so that we could then take it through to dry salts and extract useful compounds and elements from the brine to use as fertilizers. And this is just a graphic that summarizes what we're doing. So this is the cluster of technologies. We have some additional desalination to boost the productivity of the greenhouse. We have algae for biofuels, that's halophytes, concentrated solar power, greenhouse, evaporator hedges, crops growing in external fields, salt production, and this is biochar, which allows us to turn any agricultural waste into a soil conditioner. And in principle, we're using what we have a lot of, sunlight, seawater, and carbon dioxide, to produce more of what we need: biomass, oxygen, electricity, crops, and materials. It all runs on sunlight. Seawater is a major input. Carbon dioxide is absorbed at various stages in the system. And then I don't have time to go through all of these, but essentially we've been connecting all these technologies up, trying to achieve what I talked about, which is the idea of a complex, interconnected system that moves towards being highly productive and zero waste, and can produce substantial amounts of biomass, oxygen, electricity, crops, and even materials from the salt process. We built a version of this in Qatar. This was completed and opened during the climate change talks in Doha. And one of the things that we monitored on the project was biodiversity. Apart from all the other things, the greenhouse performance, the solar energy, and so on, we wanted to demonstrate what we suspected, which was that this could have really quite a powerful restorative effect. So we only looked at the animal species that appeared, and the main ones were mammals, birds, and insects, and these are the various taxonomic classifications. If we'd had more money, it would have been great to look at the full spectrum of biological life. The first thing to appear was flies, as nearly always seems to be the case. And then as soon as the first plants arrived on site, we had house sparrows. And pretty soon after that, we had grasshoppers and crickets. And then the next thing was, I think that's a wagtail. The number of insects was increasing. And we had the first butterfly that appeared. Then we had the first problematic species, rats, and that was mainly because we were being a bit careless with the seeds that we were leaving around. Then we found mice, more birds appearing, the number of insects was increasing all the time. Then, literally 3 days after the algae ponds were filled, the first dragonfly appeared. And bear in mind, this was in the middle of the desert, a long way from the nearest major bit of vegetation. I don't know where these all came from. And then we had a cat that appeared, and the number of rats started going down, but that was coincidental because the rats were almost as big as the cat. When the halophytes were established, we started getting more birds. This was a relatively rare bird. It's a hoopoe. And then we had rufous-tailed shrikes, more insects, more types of wagtail, and so on. And this was all achieved in just 8 months on a site that's 100 meters by 100 meters. So at a bigger scale, over a longer period of time, this regenerative effect would be even more pronounced. Oh yes, and finally we had a little indigenous mammal, a little jerboa, which is like a mini kangaroo with these big ears and jumping, quite sweet. So to conclude now, we're next working in Jordan, which is a country that I think really needs a project like this. We often think about Jordan as being a kind of haven of peace surrounded by troublesome neighbors, but actually it's a very precarious situation. Jordan imports something like 95% of its energy. It's one of the most water-poor countries in the world, and it's got a growing population, swelled with a lot of people fleeing conflicts and so on. So it could very easily unravel. And a project such as ours, we think, could really deliver a lot in terms of improving their food, water, and energy security. And in conclusion now, I mentioned some of the sort of frustrations of those working in the environmental field and the frustrations with economists and deniers and doomsters and so on. I don't think we should get too distracted by the doomsters or the deniers, or in fact by the optimists or the pessimists. I do think we need a more sophisticated notion of economics. We need to bring the nomos of economics together with the logos of ecology. So management based on knowledge, creating solutions that deliver optimum long-term value rather than maximum short-term return. And yes, we do need scientists to keep us informed and in some cases create justifiable fear. But as designers, I think we have a different role. Rather than creating fear about the future is something we should fearlessly create. The biomimicry solutions we've seen this evening are just a tiny fraction of what exists in a source book we've only just begun to understand. Crab shells and grib shells, high-strength polymers, high-strength composites, super-efficient structures. 3.8 billion years of research and development. 3.8 billion years of brilliant solutions eliminated by previously unimaginable scientific knowledge, facilitated by previously unimaginable digital design tools. Designers have never had such an opportunity to rethink and design solutions fit for the next billion years. And returning to those three big challenges of radical increases in resource efficiency, linear to closed loops, and a fossil fuel to a solar economy, I firmly believe those are possible. And this future that we're creating, the ecological age, that could be a really wonderful, abundant future. And of course, some people might scoff at the feasibility of shifting from fossil fuels to a solar economy. Some people might scoff at the idea of zero waste, but we know this stuff is not the stuff of fantasy, because the living world is proof of its possibility. And not just an ordinary possibility, but a wonderfully rich, abundant, and regenerative possibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, for a fascinating lecture. Our planet is really something like a garden, because apart from a few remaining truly wild places in Antarctica or perhaps in the depths of the Congo, humanity, we control everything on it, and we're remaking the air as well. So the responsibility we have is enormous, and as yet we've been pretty poor guardians. As you've said, we're very slow learners, and our linear systems are quite inadequate. You've demonstrated that we really need to learn from biology, and we really need to learn lessons of biomimicry that can be crucial in making the future on Earth better. Perhaps someday we'll apply those lessons on Mars, and as Freeman Dyson has suggested, even on Venus. So, Michael Pawlyn, thank you very, very much for your insight and your hope that we can, as humanity, move to being better for our environment than we have to hitherto. Thank you very much.